I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge, it doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
We wanted to have you back on, Chris. I mean, I say back on, this is first time on Dust Bowl Diatribes, but I've interviewed you before, and people should go back to that on my YouTube channel, Political Philosophy, to look at that interview. We wanted to have you on at this point to kind of set the stage for our next year. And we wanted to talk to you a little bit about your own journey, because so many young people don't have maybe the experience that you or I had, just regarding even being able to like seek for what we believe in, you know what I'm saying? Having the time and space to even do that. And I read some of your, well, both of us have read your biographical material, Paths to Marxism, where you talk about your own journey. So we thought we would start there with just, you know, who you were as a young person, and, you know, what your family was like, and how you got to a point fairly early on where you were attracted to Marxism.
Right. So, I'm a child of the Reagan era. And what that means is a kind of conservative reactionary turn after the New Left. So a kind of resolution to the unsettled character of the 60s and 70s, and the 60s and 70s being very different from each other as decades. So the 60s being this kind of youthful, naive, kind of radicalizing period, and the 70s being more of a slide into cynicism. And then the resolution of that being the Reagan Revolution and the turn to a kind of neoliberal consensus politics. And I think that, you know, my own family background, you know, so I'm from a working class background, and my parents are baby boomers, but of the younger cohort. And so they were a little bit young in terms of the civil rights and Vietnam experiences. My father did avoid the draft by signing up for the National Guard. But you know, they knew people that they went to high school with who went to Vietnam. And you know, so they're really creatures of the period from like 68 to 73 in terms of like their consciousness was very much affected by already a kind of cynical turn with Nixon and Watergate and this kind of stuff. And, you know, a kind of an opaque political world, you know. So the question of like, you know, what is the realm of politics? So there's a kind of a cynical and opaque character to capitalist politics that was the general background culturally for me growing up in the suburbs of New York City on Long Island. And, you know, my parents, my father went to community college, but otherwise my parents did not go to college. they were a little bit downwardly mobile from their parents. So my grandparents were all unionized workers. All four of them worked and were in the unionized workforce. They're the World War II generation. And had moved from Brooklyn to Long Island, had made that kind of suburban upward mobility move from a working class background. My grandparents, one of my grandparents is from Arkansas, and so he was an Arkie. He definitely came out of rural poverty, extreme rural poverty, and got out through the military, got out through the Navy in World War II, and was discharged in New York. And my grandmother, Italian grandmother, scooped him up. And, his family mostly dispersed out of Arkansas. They mostly went to California. So they were part of that Arkie migration to California. The Okies and the Arkies who go to California. That's most of his family. I think one of his siblings went to Texas. They mostly got out of Arkansas, though. But generally speaking, so they were upwardly mobile, that generation, out of World War II. They participated in the post-war boom. Stable employment.
Isn't that area usually called the Sun Belt, like Texas to California?
Yeah, right. So they were definitely part of that, and whereas the other wings of my family are Italian and Irish, and so are very East Coast immigrant, New York City, kind of characters, a certain kind of New York provincialism, a kind of Brooklyn provincialism, like immigrant community kind of provincialism. And, I was, again, the sort of background, I'm emphasizing this sort of background of the 60s and 70s because my parents weren't really either countercultural or new leftist, but they were nonetheless affected by the new left sensibility and the counterculture, but, very ambivalently. And I would say that my family in general, they are what's known as Reagan Democrats, meaning they are the swing vote of the white ethnic working class vote that, Nixon won over in the North to a certain extent, and then Reagan won over again. And then basically Bill Clinton and Obama won them back. So they kind of swing back and forth. And then Trump won them back again to the Republicans. So they're very typical white working class swing vote, cynical about politics, independent, would be the old Democratic Party constituency in the post-war era. Interestingly, though, Long Island had like a Republican machine. So in fact, my grandparents were part of that, right? So I recall my mother and father tried to register as independents when they first voted, and their parents were immediately called up by the machine to say you have to go back and register as Republicans.
Wow.
So it's kind of a different world than we live in now, right? Otherwise, you're going to lose your job if your children don't register as Republicans. Yeah. And, so different world, the parties were different then. I feel like there was a shift in the 70s away from that old party machine politics into a more kind of popular mediatized referendum type politics, sound bites and, obviously Ronald Reagan being a former movie actor, and so anyway, I, sort of came of age. I was precocious in the 80s, but I had a kind of a sense of the political world being a kind of corrupt place. And nonetheless, very aware that Reagan was a controversial figure that inspired a lot of passion and, kind of polarized. So there were mostly the community was kind of Reagan Democrat or Reagan Republican that I grew up in. But there were some, kind of liberal Democrats, progressive liberals, who were very anti-Reagan, especially among my teachers. So my kind of junior high school and high school teachers. And I had one friend who was the child of Irish immigrants, first generation. So they were maybe a little bit older than my parents, but they were recent immigrants from Ireland. And so they're very Irish. And that friend went to, there were two main Catholic parishes in my community. There was the liberal Catholic Church and the conservative Catholic Church. And my family went to the conservative Catholic Church. He went, and his family went to the liberal Catholic Church. And it was his older sister who kind of introduced us to leftism. So she's the one who said, read the Communist Manifesto, when I was 13. And, she was also the one who was like feeding us like new wave music, Depeche Mode, which also had this kind of leftist kind of stuff going on culturally. The political culture was kind of leftist. And so, but again, I think that I had a kind of a peculiar experience of politics and leftism from a fairly early age, early adolescence. I mentioned the liberal Catholic parish that my friend went to, and they did things like Central American Solidarity. So that church sponsored like Central American Solidarity and liberation theology type Catholicism, as opposed to my church, which was the right-wing conservative Pope John Paul II, anti-communist. And so, and that sort of opened onto a larger world that me and my friends explored in in adolescence, both in New York City and on Long Island. So in New York City, I was gay, so I was aware of myself as gay. We went to the Gay Community Center in Greenwich Village and got exposed to like the tail end of like a gay liberation kind of leftism, but with a lot of the kind of progressive liberal and identity politics culture that we're familiar with today, like progressive stack at a meeting. So at a meeting, all the women and people of color have to speak before a white man can speak. Have you ever heard of progressive stack? Yeah, it's like a way of conducting a meeting. It's to prevent the white males from dominating the meeting. And so you have to give the women and people of color an opportunity to speak before any white men can speak. And, so that, as a high school student, I was exposed to this. And on Long Island, the left, or progressive liberalism, really was characterized mostly by three groups. There were the kind of progressive Catholics, like the Catholic worker type variety of like a kind of Catholic socialism. And there were the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee. And there were the secular humanists, the atheists. Right. And they're all fired up one way or another around Reaganism. So they're against the Christian right. They're against the Central American Cold War intervention by the United States, and in favor of, the Sandinistas and the FMLN in El Salvador. One of the, kind of like moments for me, and again, I talked about being in the wake of Vietnam, the invasion of Grenada by the United States in 1983 was kind of traumatizing for me. I saw on PBS footage that by a Canadian or British journalist who was there, who, took footage of the American helicopters sweeping in and invading. And it was like watching the scene out of Apocalypse Now. I mean, it wasn't, but it was, right? Because they're firing rockets into various positions in the city in Grenada, where the Cubans and the Grenadan socialists were. And I just thought, oh, that's not the past, it's the present, right? So rather than like Vietnam being in the past, in recent past. And so again, my parents' generation, their cousins, their friends would tell Vietnam War stories, about the horrors of the war, but mostly about the horrors of the Vietnamese and how they attached bombs to babies and blew up American troops, and this kind of stuff. And, but again, it seemed like the past, and it was being processed in the popular culture, but then suddenly it was present. It was like, okay, the US is still doing this stuff. And that was, again, a way of thinking about, my relationship to the US government, but also what's the relationship between the US government and popular attitudes in my working class milieu. And then seeing an alternative to that, now the progressive Catholics and the Quakers and the secular humanist atheists, they were all higher class than my family and my community. So they also represented kind of more educated people, more wealthy people. And, so it was part of my general, like, I guess, kind of aspiration to like get out of my community, to get out of the kind of closed-minded, provincial, bigoted setting that was there. And, I wanted to go away to college, and I was, again, going into New York City, talking with my high school teachers who were very liberal, very progressive minded people. And, just the sense of, I got to get out of this place, and my leftism was part of that. Like the leftist culture was part of a kind of class mobility, a kind of, to become educated, to leave this community, to become more cosmopolitan, to become a person of the world, as opposed to stuck with these very narrow-minded people.
And would it be accurate to say, like, at that stage where you kind of being pulled in all these different, you had all these different species of leftism, and were you
but
just,
it all made sense. It all kind of came together. In other words, there was a kind of united front against Reaganism.
and
and
you had fun with that?
Well, I mean, I was unhappy with it. I have to say, I was like annoyed. I was annoyed by the Catholic worker stuff and the liberation theology stuff. That Christianity belongs to the left, not the right. And, the Quakers have their own version of that, although they're less sort of like Christian forward about it,
Like Unitarian.
And yeah, more Unitarian, exactly. And like the secular humanists also kind of annoyed me, although I shared their kind of anti-religious sentiment. I still found it a little bit like their whole thing was very pat, I thought. So I was not happy with any of the left that I really encountered. I wasn't happy with that culture at the Gay Community Center in Greenwich Village in New York City, and the progressive stack stuff, and the identity politics stuff, which was we think that it's very extreme right now, and maybe it is in a broader cultural sense, but it was as extreme back then as in that milieu in Manhattan and even on Long Island. I mean, I had, I was definitely like an anti-racist. So one of the first demonstrations I ever participated in was against the firebombing of a house that was being sold to a Black family in my community. So the NAACP came out and had a march, and I went. And it was very controversial in my family that I participated in that march against racism in my town. And that all my relatives kind of sat me down to explain, well, of course we don't want to be racist, but you have to understand the way Black people are, and look at this and that, look at these various social pathologies, look at like the crime, look at the broken families, look at the drug use, look at this, look at that. Right. And, and I just thought, no. Right. But, so again, things haven't changed very much since the 80s. They really haven't. There have been various moments when it looked like it might go in a different direction, but ultimately in 2022, what's remarkable is how little has changed as far as left culture and just sort of baseline assumptions. The kind of fight the right, unite against the right, this kind of weird, I mean, I certainly had, antagonistic feelings and hostility towards even my own family members at a political and cultural level. I did. But I also thought that the left wasn't quite correct. They were not quite right. And I did feel like they missed something about the Reaganism, right? They missed something about the appeal of the Reaganism. They didn't, they kind of, like, not to say, I felt like my family, they were racist in a kind of typical way, not very hardcore, but they were. But I felt like the left really had no way of dealing with that I found satisfactory. And so I was always unhappy with the left. I was.
Yeah. And do you think that's because, like, what is the kernel that allowed you to see that there was an appeal to Reaganism, or that the left was missing these things?
I felt like, these people could never reach my family, could never reach my community. And I did feel very strongly that for socialism to have a chance, you'd have to reach these people. You have to reach these people, that there's no way that you can do it without these people. And as absurd as my family might be. So I remember watching like a Donahue. Do you remember Donahue?
Yeah, I do.
Right? There was like, talk shows, right? There was like a Donahue show where they had members of the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Bobovakian Maoist people, and they were denouncing US imperialism and this and that. And my mother was like, do you agree with them? And I said, well, I kind of do, but I also kind of don't. Meaning that I agree with them, like, in terms of what they're saying, in terms of like how they're describing things, but I don't agree with them at the level of the rhetoric. I felt like the rhetoric and the substance. So, I told you I was already instructed to read the Communist Manifesto. I found it very fascinating. I keyed into Marx right away. I understood that there was such a thing as conservative reactionary socialism, as a kind of a bad anti-capitalism. I understood, I think implicitly, I didn't have the language for it, the dialectical approach to capitalism, the idea that capitalism is revolutionary, but it's not true to its own possibilities. I had a sense of, that the left, that there was a kind of a truth to the world that was being depicted, even in something as schematic as the Communist Manifesto. It felt like, this is my world. And I felt like it was a truth that encompassed sort of the condition of my community and my family, the working class. It really grasped something about that, and true about it, and also pointed to another possibility. And I knew that the left didn't agree with Marx. I knew that they didn't agree with Marx. I knew that all this stuff that they were spinning was not at all. And so that became, I don't know, I became a Marxist. And I knew that Marxism put me at odds with the left. And it put me at odds with, my community, my family, and my local, like village, suburb. But I didn't, I just thought there was something true about this that speaks to the reality of people that I would get into very passionate arguments with at the level of, like, especially cultural politics, like racism and this and that. So yeah, but I knew that the left was not, like, whether it was the secular humanists or the Quakers or the Catholic worker people, or even the left, like the Gay Community Center, Gay Liberation left, or at protest demos, I did encounter the existing socialist left, and or like the RCP, the Maoist, Avakian followers. I mean, I just knew that they were also not with Marx.
Before I lose the Catholic worker thread, I wanted to make sure I understood, like, you were exposed to Marx partly through that angle, right?
A little bit, yeah, but in a strange way, because again, it's not like my friend's older sister. It's not like she was totally steeped in that. It's more
Sure.
like their parents' milieu, and it was a kind of like, can we be Catholic? Can we be participants in the church and also be like leftish, at least? And because I didn't consider the Catholic worker stuff to be terribly even socialist, let alone Marxist. I thought it was more social justice. like,
Okay.
liberation theology, social justice. It was like, Catholics should be on the side of social justice. And it's kind of like, yeah, but I kind of had the sense that social justice, what I was saying earlier about a kind of conservative socialism, a kind of conservative reactionary socialism, a kind of an anti-capitalist socialism that
Mhm.
sees capitalism as an affront to social justice. And I knew that that wasn't where Marx was coming from. I knew that it wasn't a matter of social justice.
So
So I kind
would it be safe to say that the Catholic worker and liberation theology stuff was just too liberal still? In other words, it was not, they
yeah,
didn't understand Marx well enough to be able to really employ that effectively.
right. And, but also that they were pulling in a different direction, that the sentiment was, that, it's like it comes out of the 60s, the kind of anti-corporate sentiment, the idea that you have these, mega corporations and that they corrupt the realm of politics, and it's in their interest, and the little people are just crushed underfoot. And I thought, well, okay, sure, but you know what are you really upholding as an alternative? And so the thing with Catholic worker is that it made sense at the level of Catholicism, or even like the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee, or even like the secular humanists. Like it made sense as like a kind of a personal ethics. Like, so even the atheists, like leftism was a matter of like where your heart is, your sentiment, and you want to be on the side of the downtrodden, and you want to be with the good people, not the bad people, and you want to be one of the good people. And so it struck me as like, these people don't really want to change the world. These people want to feel good about themselves. They want to be on the right side of things. And I just thought, being on the right side of things is just not going to get you anywhere politically. Like, in other words, I mean, of course, I wanted to be on the right side of things. I wanted to be with the downtrodden and the oppressed. I was sympathetic, of course, and I saw my family as oppressed by capitalism. I did. And, I, of course, want to be on the side of the people, in that sense, social justice. But I thought, this is just not going to cut it. Like, this is not sufficient. This view is ultimately not going to lead anywhere. And I did have this sense of, this should lead somewhere. And it was the 80s. There was a lot going on. It's the second, kind of the rebooted Cold War. It's Cold War II, Reagan. It's these proxy wars in, Latin America, or Grenada. It's throughout the world, in fact, although I wasn't as aware of it. I became aware a little bit later in high school. I got into South African solidarity too. So not only Central American solidarity, but anti-apartheid. And of course, New York's a great place to be, because you do have Central American people, and you did have African people, South African exiles. Like, so I could meet people who were literally in the ANC, or the South African Communist Party, or literally FMLN cadre, like real, like they are militants, and they're just living in the US because it got too hot for them in their home country. And, and I could talk to them. First, I could talk to them firsthand about what they're doing, what they think they're doing. And it struck, again, the post-Vietnam era, it struck me, they were like, well, we don't want to repeat of Vietnam in Central America. We don't want to repeat of Vietnam in South Africa. We want to try to push the envelope, achieve what we can achieve, but we don't want to trigger a US invasion, right? Because the US will just destroy us, and we don't want that, And I just thought, okay, and then their attitude also was, and I said, well, what about socialism in the United States? What about the struggle for socialism in the United States? I mean, remember, this was a time like Red Dawn. Do you remember that movie, Red Dawn? With, is Patrick Swayze in it?
I think so. Yeah, I remember it.
Yeah, and it's just like really nuts. And, the Russians and the Cubans are marching down the street, and they have like, They do a little parade in the occupied town, and they have a portrait of Marx and a portrait of Abraham Lincoln. And they do this thing. And it's like, would I be on the side of the Wolverines, the resistance, or would I be on the side of the occupation? Would I be on the side of the communists? And I kind of felt like I wouldn't be on either side, and but anyway, so it just, the sense that one had in the 80s, it's hard to recall now, but it was a kind of apocalyptic sense. I mean, there was the threat of nuclear war, of course, but there was like an earthquake once on Long Island. I woke up like 4:30 in the morning as a high school student, or maybe it was junior high school, and I thought, this is the end of the world. Like, I thought they did it. They launched the nuclear strike. That's what I'm being woken up by. The ground is rumbling because we're about to be vaporized. But apart from that, I did have this sense that the world was in contention, that there was a struggle, and it was symbolized by the Cold War, but it wasn't reducible to that. I already knew that. And so I just had a sense of like, okay, all these things are fucked up in the world, certainly, but what are we going to do about it? What are we actually going to do about it? And Jesse Jackson, he was like, we should be supporting Nicaragua, not going against them, and we should be supporting the African countries that border on South Africa, the frontline states. We shouldn't be supporting South Africa. Like, as US policy, he was like, I'm running for president in order to switch sides in these conflicts. And so, as implausible as that sounds, it was like, oh, okay, yeah, right. So, in other words, even in mainstream capitalist politics, because he did pretty well in the primaries, Jesse Jackson, in 84 and 88. And he won, significant portions of like white working class voters in the Democratic primaries. And so it seemed like, things are possible. It did seem like actual things are possible. And yet I felt like the left, they were resigned to basically things staying the way they were. And and just supporting the Democrats against Reagan and the evil Republicans because they represent Christian fascism, right? The abortion thing coming back this year has been a little traumatic for me. My grandmother, my Italian grandmother, my mother's mother, she would go to anti-abortion protests. She would picket abortion clinics herself and pray and do that stuff as the head of the Rosary Society at the church. She was the head of the Rosary Society at the church. Angelina was her name. And this very little, stereotypical Italian woman, militantly anti-abortion, again, kind of funny, kind of Italian American, kind of working class, kind of racist, bigoted, whatever type person, definitely, for sure. But I mean, for Christ's sake, I feel like she was part of Operation Rescue or something. I mean, like, literally, so again, these things felt like, people are doing things, again, demonstration in my home community over racism, and it did feel like the left was resigned to things not really changing, not in the way that Marx was talking about change, right? And yet the Cold War, fighting against communism, and well, what do you want, the US to go communist? Like, this is things that my uncles would say to me, or my parents' cousins. They'd be like, Chris, you're a communist? And I'm like, yeah, I'm a communist, Marxist. Like, you want the US to go communist? And I'm like, what's wrong with that? But
Stalinism, right? Or something.
Yeah, and I didn't want it to be Stalinism, of course. And I also just thought it just wouldn't be in the United States. Like, I just thought, this is not some poor country like the Soviet Union. But I have to say that the leftists I met were as incredulous of my Marxism as my family was. Like, they were like, oh, you're some kind of hardcore Marxist, like, as a dismissal. is like, oh, that's totally implausible. And anyway, it's not going to happen. And we wouldn't want it to happen if it could happen. Right. So, I just had this sense of like, okay, I'm jacked up on these ideas. Everybody seems to be rejecting them left and right, But anyway, so that's just me. I'm like a peculiar person, but I do think that I was shaped by my moment in these ways. Social justice, though, I knew that it wasn't about social justice. I knew it was about profound societal change, and it was about politics. I knew that social justice and bleeding heartism, sentimentality was not enough. It was not enough, even though I was very much moved by these things like everybody else on the left, and even people like my family on the right. It's not like they didn't care about oppression and things. They just felt like we can't do anything about it. And meanwhile, we're not going to sacrifice ourselves to do the right thing because we can't really afford it. Like as working class people, like we're against racism, but we don't want like the social pathology of the Black poor to come into our community. Can you blame them? No, you can't blame them for that. Not really. Yeah, it made them like racist, but like in an understandable way. They weren't wrong entirely, and certainly the left was just like sentimentally like, oh, you just have to deny that there is such a thing as social pathology, and crime is just like a made-up problem or something. It's like, it's not a made-up problem for working class people. It is not. It's a real thing that people have to be worried about, but it was like, yeah, if you care about that, then you're just a racist and you're just a right-winger. And it's like,
Which is a position you can only hold if you're living in relative security and don't
right,
need all those things. Yeah.
right, and yeah, I mean, it's just it's like I said, it's remarkable how little has changed in 40 years. It's like you can't say certain things, you can't talk about certain things, you can't even let those things enter your head. You can't deal with social reality. You have to like blind yourself one way or another way, so it's hard, because I just feel like I can't not know things, whether through experience or through my formal education or my self-education. Like I can't like pretend I don't know things about reality, and yet it seems like the political world and the left, which is what I care about, it's like you have to deny reality. And it's like, well, then clearly you're not interested in really engaging in it, let alone changing it.
And what trips me up and why it was so refreshing when I first found you is that it's like, on the one hand, they want to deny reality, that there are, that just because you're poor doesn't mean you're a virtuous person.
Right.
Just because you're poor doesn't mean, you can't just take the cook and have them run the country. There's all these issues. They can go blind to that. But then if you say like, well, hey, maybe Marxism calls us to a revolutionary reconstitution of society, they're like, oh, that's crazy. You are delusional. You are in denial. It's like I experienced a version of this growing up in Western Kansas during the War on Terror, where it's like, I'm surrounded by Republicans. We hate big government, but also they're spying on us with the Patriot Act, and they're spending billions in wars that it's not clear what it's for. But we don't have the money. We don't have the money for poor Black people to have welfare. But it's fine that they're spying on us, even though we value our liberty. It's like, I don't understand how people shift gears. Do you have any insight into that? And hopefully those connections made sense.
No, that makes total sense. I mean, I guess people talk about it as cognitive dissonance, right? Mm-hmm. And, you could also psychologize it. You could say that, one of my favorite New Left era authors is Juliet Mitchell, and she calls it the normative psychosis of our social and political reality. And, because it is hard to take on board. It is, and it's hard to square things. I think it's, to get back to the question of like more of an ethical kind of approach to these things, whether it's like the Quakers or the Catholics or the, secular humanist atheists. I guess it's, in some kind of a religious way, it's easier to accept these things because it sort of makes sense. It's a fallen world of sin or of human fallibility, like that would be the atheist's sort of scientific kind of approach,
Ignorance is
Right. And I just kind of feel like, well, that would all make sense. And you could just leave it at that. Absolutely. And that's the way most people navigate the world. But that's in terms of reconciling yourself to reality, you can have that perspective. But what if you want to change reality? And I've always been, I guess, clear on this point also, and also this put me at odds with the New Left people. I always had a sense that it didn't require kind of prefigurative politics. In other words, it didn't require for people to morally or ethically improve themselves first before we can change the world. That it's not like an individual spiritual journey of moral uplift and improvement. I mean, yes, like if there was a real movement for socialism, probably that would involve that to a certain extent. It would. But I also thought not as much as people think. In our time, like fighting against your inner racist or something. And it's like, I felt like people are deeply racist, but people also are not deeply racist. They're just not, meaning it just doesn't, they can have like abstract racist views, but then it can have no impact whatsoever on their actual relations and friendships and connections with actual people of color. And so, certainly I had that experience in my family, which is that there would be these kind of crazy racist attitudes. Meanwhile, close friends and even like in the family, in the extended family, there were Black and other people of color. And so, it was kind of like, well, it's like those Black people, not these Black people, or something like that. There was always, like that kind of thing. And again, all among working class people. So it wasn't like a class thing. It wasn't like Black middle class people are okay. It was like, no, my coworker is okay. And my coworker who's Black complains about the same things that I'm worried about, in terms of the social pathology in the Black neighborhoods or whatever. And so again, it's kind of like we just really don't have to do this thing that people imagine, sort of like,
unless their normative psychosis demands that we do.
Well, there's that, right? And so, I mean, I just feel like it's so in the realm, like bringing it into the realm of psychology is like, deeply unfortunate, and yet we're kind of left there to a certain extent because we don't have much else apart from individuals and their attitudes and their thinking or something, their beliefs. And, because obviously we don't have anything else kind of organizing and disciplining people, right? So we're kind of relying on people maintaining the right psychological orientation, that they care about the right things and that they have the right attitudes and beliefs about those things, that it really does come down to a very individualistic matter. Because we don't have anything else, we don't have anything else where it could be like, oh, well, so-and-so has some problematic attitudes, but, they're good comrades in the party or something. There's just nothing, I mean, I guess there's a little bit of that with like, the degree to which people do any kind of social organizing, on the ground out of necessity, of any kind, like not just what we normally think of as like, I don't know, like union organizing and things like that. People can bracket their attitudes for the purposes of those things. They certainly can, but it's very rare that we have that context in which things can be put in their proper place, where it doesn't seem like it's a matter of, an argument with your coworkers or buddies, friends over whatever, something in the news that you're supposed to have an opinion about.
Mhm.
You know, there's no counterbalance to that. So yeah, I mean, it's true that people hold like antithetical ideas. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's an expression of like contradiction or dialectics or anything like that, because it doesn't even rise to that level.
Mhm.
You know, it's more at the level of we have to, you know, find some way psychologically of dealing with contradictory realities, you know,
And this,
in a concrete way.
and this is a way we can vent at like the group and more macro social level, is that we can take sides in the culture war and feel like this is all going to add up to change.
Yeah, we can take sides. We can kind of believe that the world would be a better place if the majority of people agreed with us in their beliefs and attitudes, if they shared our sentiments. You know, if they felt the same way as we did about things, then, you know, and that we're just, you know, doing everything that we can to try to make that happen. You know, to try to get people on the same page at the level of attitudes. And so, you know, again, a very basic point, which is that we have to change reality, not attitudes. You know, that attitudes stem from reality. And as long as the reality doesn't change, these attitudes are not going to change. They're just not. Like you can tell kids in school, you can, you know, elementary school, you can start as young as you want. You can drill into them all the progressive liberal values. They're still going to grow up to be conservative reactionaries because society is going to subject them to pressures, you know, that are going to make them have antisocial attitudes or be cynical or you know, focus on their own individual existence because they have to survive. You know, these things are not going to go away. It's not, no amount of cultural norms, you know, no amount of product pumped out of Hollywood is gonna eliminate the possibility of people having ugly, bigoted attitudes.
So you were already disillusioned with the New Left before you got to college, is that right?
Yes, and I went to a very lefty school. So I had a boyfriend in high school, and he discovered Hampshire College as an alternative to the other schools we were considering, which were Amherst College and Williams College. We wanted to have the New England small liberal arts college experience. It was part of our vision of what college was supposed to be. I could have gone to Columbia University because I was in a kind of an early college kind of high school program at Columbia in my last 2 years of high school. But I that was like a science program, and I got disillusioned with that. I probably could have gone to Columbia anyway, even if I wasn't going to be a science major. I wanted to get further away from my family, from my home community. You know, I wanted to go away to school, not so far that I couldn't visit home, but far enough that, you know, I had that distance. And, you know, so New England seemed like, you know, a natural place for New York City area kids to go to college. And Hampshire College appealed because of the leftism, because me and Phil were leftists. I mean, we were participating on the left in New York at the time. And, you know, we thought of ourselves as Marxists. And, you know, again, I had my little group of friends, and we kind of, I don't know, educated each other, and, you know, we educated ourselves together, which is always helpful to not be doing it on your own. And, you know, really talking about a lot of different things that way, like bouncing ideas. How do we really think about these things? How do we, you know, feel about these things? So Hampshire College, you know, appealed in that way. Very different environment though. I already had this experience going to Columbia University in my last 2 years of high school. That suddenly I was in a different class of people. I was with the rich kids. And it was, you know, culturally, I didn't belong there. I really didn't. One of my earliest experiences, like when I first arrived at Hampshire, was quite scary, quite traumatizing. So I was a scholarship student, and I had a certain kind of scholarship, and they had a reception dinner at the president of the college's house. for us scholarship recipients. And we had to go to the quad to be picked up to be taken to her house. And it was all these Black students. And I was the one white student. And I had this dawning terror, fear, that I had been mistakenly given the scholarship because somehow they thought I was Black. Right? But it turns out, so most of the scholarships are reserved for the Black students, but they reserved 1 or 2 for a white student, and I was the one. Right? Because I was poor enough, basically. So it was need-based, but it was also affirmative action. And so, but I had this terrifying, I was like, did I check the wrong box on my application? Like, I was like totally terrified. I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen to me now? And so, but in general, the college, interestingly, my professors were like baby boomer, new left generation and very new left background, like lefty. And they were very tri-state area, New York type people. And some of them were working class people, working class background people. And, Jewish American, Italian American, etc. And, so, there was a kind of a WASPy element to the student population, but the professors were not necessarily that. And, so I found it easier to relate to my professors than to my fellow students at a cultural level. But then it became this other debate about how I needed to reject Valley Stream. I needed to reject Long Island in the way that they had rejected their white ethnic working class backgrounds as conservative reactionary. And it became this whole struggle about like Marxism, and they were like, well, we kind of been there, done that. We were all Marxists in our youth, but now we've learned that you have to like agree with Foucault, that's more like real than Marxism. We learned our lesson and you have to learn your lesson. And I was like, fuck that now. Right. So
Totally resonate with that.
Yeah, and I just knew, like, like Foucault, fine, but I was just like, yeah, you know what? No.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I knew, like, being told you have to reject Marx, because Marxism is Eurocentric and it's patriarchal and it's homophobic. And look at what Marx and Engels wrote in their letters to each other. And they're making all these racist and sexist and homophobic remarks about people. And I'm like, yeah, I just don't care. I do not care, like, at all. I think in that article, I talked about how I met Adolph Reed when I was in college. It just so happened. So I was home, visiting, and I read a column that he wrote in Newsday, Long Island Newsday newspaper. And it was about Black identity politics on campus, and student activism. And it was a criticism. And I wrote him, like via Newsday, I wrote him a letter that got to him at Yale University, and he wrote me back. And he's like, you're in school with my son. His son was going to school in the same class as me. I didn't realize Touré was Adolph's son. And he's like, and I have friends who teach there, and so I visit, I visit my son, I visit, see my friends up there. And so next time I'm in town, we'll talk. All right. And so we got to know each other, and then he was invited to speak in one of my classes by one of my professors who was a friend of his. And, he gave this very Marxist kind of thing about like criticizing identity politics and, understanding where the identity politics came after the 60s, that it's about abandoning the struggle for socialism and struggle to overcome capitalism. And it's, about neoliberal capitalism, all this stuff. And, so students are almost all white in the class, and, 2 Marxist professors. And the next week after Adolph spoke in our class, the students were like, why would an African-American be interested in a 19th century Jewish intellectual, Marx? And my professors were like, that's a good question. And I was like, and these are my Marxist professors. And I just like involuntarily stood up and yelled, that is not a good question. You know?
Did you get a chance to
And
defend that?
well, it sort of got a little bit pandemonium. You can imagine that my fellow students were like, oh, Chris Cutrone, yeah, he's some jacked up Marxist and whatever. And so they, got into this argument. And and afterwards my professors kind of chastised me a little bit for being rude to my fellow students and for kind of calling them out. I'm like, Adolf's your friend and you guys are Marxists and you're going to let the students do that? Like be some smart ass bullshit about like what business does a black person have being a Marxist? You're going to let that fly in a class that's about Marxism? Or about the history of socialism. I think it was a history of like socialist revolution. So we looked at, the Russian Revolution and China and Cuba and whatever, right? One of the professors was a Cuba scholar and acquaintance of Fidel Castro. And it was always rumored that she had had an affair with Fidel Castro or Che or both.
Way to
right?
live.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's cool. But, and it's like, I just thought, what the fuck, man? And I felt very betrayed by my professors, because I felt like I was learning all these ideas from them, learning this interesting history from them. And at the first chance, they just tossed it. It's like, oh, the students aren't interested. Yeah, you know what? It is irrelevant. You're right. And of course, they had this funny, they are friends with Adolf, but they're not like close friends. And so they're just like, oh, yeah, well, Adolf, he's very, kind of persnickety and he disagrees with everybody. He's like a cranky Marxist and, you can't be that. You can't act like that. And I was like, no, you got to be just like that. I was like, I saw kind of a role model for myself in Adolf.
This is just as simple as separating a person's personal background or their personality from the ideas, which any intellectual should be able to do.
You mean the ad hominem fallacy? Yeah. Of course. No, this is personal as fucking political, man. It was total feminism. Hampshire College, total personal as political. They were so upset about Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. They were really, 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 my professors, they were like spellbound by the Senate hearing confirming Clarence Thomas and the charge of sexual harassment by Anita Hill. And, and I was just like, where's your Marxism? It's like, oh yeah, Clarence Thomas is this right-wing guy. And so of course he's a sexist who sexually harassed a law clerk. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I don't know that follows. I don't know that his like constitutional theory follows from some like personal depravity. Long dong silver, pubic hair left on a Coke can. Do you remember that stuff, Lori?
I do remember it as crazy. Yeah, crazy.
And it's just like, that's politics,
Yeah, they spent hours and hours on 24/7 TV just about that Coke can.
Yeah. And what's the significance of the Coke can, right? Mm-hmm. What's the implication? And
I guess I have a theory. Tell me how plausible you think this is. Do they have to focus on all of these salacious details because what they don't want to confront is, as a person of color, why is he even right wing?
Right. Exactly. It's like, why is this guy a conservative? And are you going to take seriously his conservatism, that he actually believes this, that it's not some like internal psychodrama, like struggle with his identity? He's like black and very proud of his blackness and a conservative, and there's nothing contradictory about that at all.
Unless they think every black person would think like they do.
Yeah, should be a Democrat is what they mean, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's the same thing with fucking Adolf, right? Like my students were reacting against Adolf's criticism of progressive liberals, identity politics. And they were just like really uncomfortable with the fact that a Black person was criticizing the Democratic Party's approach to racism. And so they kind of were like, oh yeah, he's using Marx as an excuse or something. So they went after the Marxism as like, oh, this is his way of justifying his otherwise intolerable disagreement. Right? So he pretends he's criticizing things from the left, but actually he must be a right winger because he's criticizing the Democrats. Right?
Mhm.
And it's just like, fuck no.
And then part of me thinks they need to hold that stance and they need to focus on Adolf Reed and do this half-ass psychoanalysis, because what they don't want to confront is that they're like one standard deviation to the left of your Democrat Reagan family.
Totally. Oh,
and-
exactly. Exactly. But it's, yep.
And that they can have all this education, they can have read all the Foucault and all this or that, but they're Democrats.
And it boiled down to it. And, I'll go one step further. I felt like their dismissal of Adolf was itself racist.
Oh, yeah.
But you can't say that because only a Republican would say that.
Yeah, because it's like, I felt like these are white students who have a discomfort and ultimately an attitude of contempt towards a Black Marxist because he's Black. In other words, if a white person had made the argument, they might have taken it more seriously in one way, maybe less seriously in another way, meaning that they could more easily dismiss it. But it kind of got under their skin. It kind of rankled them. And they had to retreat into this kind of, well, he's somehow inauthentic as a Black person because he's not like quoting Malcolm X, he's quoting Karl Marx.
Long story short, because this is not my story, but when I first applied for jobs, just because I wanted to teach the classics of political thought, I got hazed by every single East Coast interview. It was horrendous. I was made to feel like I was in the wrong field. It wasn't that I didn't have anything against feminist theory. I just didn't want to do it.
No, I mean, obviously there's a lot of interesting stuff, but if you want to do like classics, I mean, I encountered this in my teaching now, which is that I really have to put up a kind of principled opposition to DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, or as I like to call it, DIE, or I guess you could call it DAY, like Opus Dei. Like Catholic reactionaries, right? So, because I just have to say, I think that the students, whether white or people of color, should learn the classics, meaning they should not have this withheld from them.
Right.
Right? That my students of color, for sure, deserve to read Kant.
Mm-hmm.
And, they deserve to read things that everyone's going to make reference to. Everyone's going to name drop. They're going to say Kantian this, Hegelian that, Freudian, whatever. And they deserve to encounter these things firsthand for themselves, because it's not all old hat to them. It isn't. These are young people. They need to be educated. They need the same education that the professors think that they have, but of course the professors don't really have that either. They don't really have a solid background in this stuff. And so they're uncomfortable. So it falls to me to teach the classics. They don't want to. My colleagues don't want to teach that stuff. They want to teach all secondary stuff. They want to teach commentary and feminist critiques of this and that. And it's like, well, that's all well and good, but how are you going to adjudicate those arguments if you don't know the primary object? If you don't know what they're talking about? And how can you judge what they're saying? It will just sound plausible. It will sound like, oh, well, we know that the classics are racist and sexist because it's all dead white men, without ever having to think, what would that mean? Like, and how does that affect the thinking? And, just the implausibility of it at a basic level, but it's never even acknowledged, that, you'd have to actually make the case And you'd have to deal with the primary object in some serious way, not in some superficial way. And obviously people have tried to make the argument at a substantial level. I think those arguments tend to be wrong anyway, but at least they try to make the argument substantially, but they do so by dealing with this material. And so if the students never have access to that material, how are they're just gonna take our word for it? The latest feminist critique of Kant is valid. They're just gonna, they can't think about it for themselves. They can't adjudicate it. They just have to accept. Now we know, the latest scholarship has shown, and it's like, until 10 years from now, when the latest scholarship will say something else, and how will these students ever navigate any of that? And I think it's based on a fundamental cynicism about education, right? In other words, it's based on a fundamental cynicism. It's like when I was getting exercised at Hampshire College over the dismissal of Adolph Reed, that, I think that my professors had basically accepted the fact that the students are not going to really take Marxism seriously anyway. And so it kind of doesn't matter. There's no point in defending this stuff because the students aren't going to, like I said, the teachers who themselves had been Marxists, they were like, well, the students aren't interested. They're interested in Foucault now. And so we have to do that. And I'm like, wait, the students are interested in what you tell them to be interested in. They're young people. They're going to be interested in the first thing that you put in front of them. Right. And so, it's like, but they pretend, well, we can't teach what we know because the students won't be interested. It's a crazy abdication. I guess because I just remember when I didn't know anything, and how vital it was for me to be exposed to certain things.
Me too. But it's like the customer service model. Yeah, it's, yeah. Anyway, I totally resonate with that. I spent most of my career teaching the classics for those very reasons.
Yeah, I don't, my students, because academic teaching is not like being a leftist. Like being a leftist, I guess, in the world, I'm trying to promote certain ideas and I am trying to, I guess, propagandize or something. In the classroom, I'm not trying to do that because it's take it or leave it. It's like, I hope that they find these ideas interesting and they'll do with it what they want to do with it. And so with me, I just feel like it's like a duty as an educator to expose students to things that people will continue to make reference to. People will continue to debate these old ideas. That's never going to stop, really. And so the only question is whether they have adequate resources to participate or not, or whether they're going to take it, secondhand, pre-digested. Maybe they will. I've basically taught at elite schools. So, there's that, where I feel like some of them might become academics. Some of them might become intellectuals of some kind after graduating, even if they don't become academics. But yeah, I don't feel like, but it's like you're put into this position where you have to ideologically defend teaching the classics. And it's like, it doesn't require an ideological defense. Like there's no political reason. There's just a basic educational reason. But yeah, so that's a whole other thing. And obviously the relationship between the left and academia, I feel like the left has facilitated the self-liquidation of academia. It's given a kind of political excuse. It's given a kind of ideological gloss over something kind of rotten. I guess, the customer service model, I guess.
I understand what you're saying in the abstract. Like more concretely, what does that excuse making look like, do you think? The left making an excuse for the intellectual liquidation of academia substance.
I think that it's, at a concrete level, I think, generally academics are not clear as to the relevance or substance of these ideas themselves. And so they probably struggle with, why do students need this? At a more substantial level. At a more cynical level, they understand that, students are just making their way through school to get a degree that will just help them on the job market, like having a college degree from a better school, that these are job market discrimination devices, basically, and that's what it all amounts to. So I think it's a kind of a twofold thing, which is, what do the students want out of their education? They just want the piece of paper at the end. And, they want the degree. And so there's that aspect. And then the aspect of, I think after the 60s, I think there has been, for political reasons, for social and political reasons, there has been a great deal of uncertainty as to the actual relevance of these ideas. In other words, the ideas themselves become uncomfortable because they challenge us too much. Not only Marx, who should challenge us a great deal thinking about capitalism, but even the old, kind of classical liberal bourgeois thinkers challenge us. They would challenge this reality. They would, just, if to take these ideas seriously would present a challenge to our social and political reality. And so being able to say that somehow they didn't really mean it, sort of qualify the ideas out of existence. So these things kind of dovetail, I think. The changing purpose of education, that there's less room, there's less headspace, there's less time and energy, there's less mental space for education, for thinking, for taking the 4 years and just pondering, there's that, there's the instrumentalization of education, and the casualization of teachers. There's the part-time kind of student phenomenon where they have to work their way through school, and therefore don't really have time to do anything except keep up their grades in the most efficient way possible. But again, on the teacher's side of it, I think it's because most of us teachers are not in a position to actually stand by the value of these ideas.
Well, and wouldn't it,
because
I've absorbed this idea through Adorno and through Platypus Talks, the idea that, because we never realized communism, we're regressing into rackets. And so part of what's happening at the professor's level is they have to maintain their niche in this racket. And so so these ideas can be weaponized against your competitors, and you can't be bothered to really try and educate your kids or students.
That's true too. Absolutely. That's true too. No, I mean, certainly that's true. There is the small differences among academics, quote unquote, intellectually, not really intellectually, but more, I guess, the level of disciplinary scholarship, whatever, disciplinary boundaries, what people think that they're doing. Yeah, but I mean, so they but again, I feel like the disciplines have been in full retreat for a while. I think the disciplines have had a hard time justifying themselves, especially in the humanities and the social sciences. And then it's only made worse now by the idea of decolonizing the curriculum or some nonsense like that. I mean, it's just it's a curious phenomenon, because it's I don't think that it could happen as easily as it is now, quite, if education itself had been kind of evacuated of its substance. So I think that yeah, I don't know who wants an education. I mean, some of my students definitely do. They do. And maybe it was always a minority of students who really wanted an education. But I think that in general, going back to like the 50s and 60s, like that generation, the student activists of the 60s, I think that they wanted a real education. I think that they did, in a way that whether rich or poor, regardless of their background, middle class, rich, poor, they wanted something out of their education. I'm not sure that students, whether they're privileged or not, really want an education anymore. And so, I mean, I do think that it's been a long process, this liquidation. And I'm more concerned about at the idea level. I mean, so yeah, I mean, it's true that in Platypus, we talk about regression as like, being stuck in capitalism and giving up a kind of horizon of possibilities. But yeah, there were, in the 50s and 60s, there were like alternatives to Marxism that were posed, kind of post-Marxist ideas, like Foucault or whatever, right? But all sorts of things. People were having ideas about the potential better future of society, in a way that I don't think is the case now, actually. Right. I think, it's just now about how, a better future means the working class having a smaller carbon footprint. That's what a better future means. It doesn't mean, an actual betterment of society. Not at all. And I don't think, I mean, maybe the millennials had a moment when they wanted a better society. I think they've retreated from that in a very subtle, unconscious kind of way.
Well, and do you think it's likely that part of the ferment in the 50s and 60s was you were still in this post-World War II boom, but then after the 70s contraction, neoliberalism, as we enter, what's the subtitle of Culture of Narcissism, like Age of Diminishing Expectations or something like that?
For real. I think definitely. I think that that's definitely true. And again, that seemed to have been reversed for a moment with the millennials. In other words, it did seem like the millennials wanted more than my generation dared to hope for.
And is that, politically, are you talking about Occupy?
Yeah, I'm just everything. I feel like the way they were offended by the war on terror, which was stupid in a lot of ways and naive, but it was also authentic. And of course, it was true that the war on terror was a debacle that only made things worse. Right. And, in other words, it was an implausible idea. We're going to democratize the Muslim world and get rid of these right-wing fundamentalists. Like that, it was sort of on the face of it, a kind of an implausible idea. And
for me at age 12, being surrounded by Republicans that wanted a kind of Christian fundamentalist version of the Taliban. But these people are anyway.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I'm not quite ready to concede that whether they, whether Christian fundamentalists are quite the same, because I don't think that they're ever quite as radical.
No,
I mean,
they're so influenced by liberalism that
they are. I mean, I guess I've always thought that the Islamic fundamentalism was ephemeral, meaning I thought that, I mean, not to say that it can't have a huge impact. It can have a huge impact, mostly in the Muslim world, right? But I also thought, it's like what's going on in Iran right now, which is that a young generation of people don't want to live in a theocracy, right? And so it is kind of like, can you keep this going more than a generation? Probably not. Probably can't. Right. And so, I mean, in the long array of history, because this is how I've learned to think about these things. As a Marxist, I've had to think about things in terms of centuries and decades, not years. I just thought the Muslim world is not going to be Al Qaeda and ISIS. Not really. Not for any considerable length of time. Yeah, maybe for a generation, but I didn't even think that. And so, the whole thing was a little bit whatever. And again, I do think that the millennials were shocked, again, in a kind of ugly, naive way about, they were just like, we're going to torture people in Guantanamo Bay. And it's like, yeah, you're going to torture a few hundred people in Guantanamo Bay, maybe a few thousand people at black sites around the world. That's not the biggest crime being committed in the world. It isn't. It is crazy and outrageous and counterproductive for sure. But, it's not, if that's all they did. But no, instead they threw these countries into civil wars with hundreds of thousands of casualties, and that, is just clearly like, well, surely we don't have to accept that. Except maybe we do. I mean, look at what's going on in Ukraine with Russia. And of course, throughout this whole period, there were various civil wars in Africa and the Congo. I mean, this stuff does go on.
Mm-hmm.
And, but again, the kind of optimism of like, well, we don't have to accept that as an inevitable world. And we don't. We actually don't. These things are in some way avoidable. They are. And therefore are criminal. These are atrocities. These are crimes. But I feel like we're far from that moment of just even the ugliness of the naivete of we don't have to accept this. The way the 60s generation didn't want to accept Vietnam. Mm-hmm. That was, there was a kind of naivete to that. There was a kind of ugly naivete to that. But there was also a kernel of truth to it, which is that the war in Vietnam was a gratuitous slaughter that might have not been in any way inevitable.
Sure.
So,
Mm-hmm.
and so I kind of feel like, okay, but where has that gone now? Where's that just little bit of optimism, little bit of hope, little bit of we can do better? Where is that? In 2022, where's that?
Mm-hmm.
Seems gone.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's why we wanted to interview you, is how do you hold on to Marxism at this late date in this
throughout all these decades? See, it's easier for me because I've been doing it my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's easier for me to hold on because I've been through the ups and downs a few times now, right? The only question for me, in currently, like in recent times, but also really in the entire time of like Platypus, since my students became kind of radicalized by their moment, by their generational moment, which was pretty early on in terms of my teaching career, because I kind of got a late start as a young teacher because I went back to grad school a little bit late and stuff like that. I do feel like what we're kind of faced with is the legacy of these ideas and how will these ideas be preserved going forward, rather than how will they be actualized right now. I've always throughout my life recognized the distance from these ideas of present social and political possibilities, but nonetheless the vitality of the ideas, despite the fact that they're not immediately applicable. I've had to deal with that. I mean, I probably had an illusion at a certain point when I was a Spartacus youth member in college, when I was around a Trotskyist group, and not just any Trotskyist group, but like an Orthodox Trotskyist group, like hardcore Marxist, or at least they thought so. Of like, around the time of the fall of the wall. And again, that sense from the 80s that there was something in contention, that there were possibilities. But again, not immediately, but in some foreseeable way, in some, horizon of history that, was foreseeable in some way. But I've had to kind of temper those expectations. So that's probably the moment when I was in college was probably the moment when I had a sense of, oh, these ideas could become relevant politically. They could sort of get some actual traction. You could have a new movement. I mean, what's interesting is that I had that sense, but then with the millennial left, I saw many more students actually mobilized in that direction than when I had been a student. And so it seemed like a greater possibility, at least to get this train on the right track and on the way, you know. It seemed like there was a chance of something, but but I've also, I think, in the back of my head throughout this whole, like, the last 20 years, let's say, had this sense that my own work, what I was doing, the educational work I was doing, not like my writing so much. I mean, I've done a fair amount of writing, but more just my in the trenches education as a public intellectual and as a, organizer of Platypus, that I'm trying to safeguard the legacy of these ideas more long term. That it's, Adorno, it's a message in a bottle, it's a time capsule, it's something that you shoot into orbit and then it will come back down to Earth in 100 years and hopefully people will make use of it. Something like that, something like, like, let's boil it down to the desert island disc phenomenon, of like, if you had to be a castaway and you could only have 100 books, what would they be? In terms of saving the world, not in terms of like literature and culture, but in terms of like politically saving the world. And I am willing to prioritize that. I am willing to say, what it comes down to is whether politically something can ever be done.
So
That's
Well, and I mean, that's a great segue too. I mean, one of the, and maybe it's symptomatic of the left in general, but like having listened to you over the years in podcasts, like everybody wants to bicker with you or like nitpick little details. And I've had to find like needles and haystacks. So we were kind of hoping you could lay out like what your vision is / what is Platypuses and how different are those? I mean, I know there's diversity of opinion in it, but also it seems like you're pretty influential. So
yeah, without being interrupted and nitpicked with.
Oh, well, I mean, it's a funny thing. I mean, it's I would say that, Platypus is a specific project. And it was very much a project of the millennial left moment. And then we now have to sort of see how it survives that moment. Meaning, when people are motivated to like reach back to the history of Marxism, then how to deal with all the accumulated history that sort of gets in the way of true appreciation of the ideas. So dealing with all the various off ramps to Marxism, right? And the left kind of embodies that. So, often we'll encounter, so in Platypus, we're not really promulgating like a politics or even an ideology or an interpretation of Marx or an analysis of present reality. We're not. It's very via negativa. It's very much about curating the existing left just to get a lay of the land of how all the various tendencies on the left represent off-ramps from Marxism that the last 100 years have accumulated. So the left has many forms of, we don't want to be Marxist like that. We don't want to be orthodox Marxist. Well, Marx is good, but now we know this and that. And we have to go beyond Marx, or we have to be at variance with Marx. And, so, whether it's Trotskyism or Maoism or Stalinism or social democracy or just plain like radical liberalism or regular liberalism or anarchism, or, like conservatism to a certain extent, like avowed conservatism, which doesn't have to trouble itself as much as people who think of themselves on the left. And so, just all the ways of thinking about ideas, but also thinking about social and political reality and social and political possibilities, all the ways that people have departed from Marxism or have rejected Marxism or qualified it, bracketed it in some way, which all were very plausible in their moment, were all authentic expressions of a plausible, like, we need to do something different. We need to, rethink things, we need to come at things fresh and not be dogmatic and hidebound and slaves of the past. That's all well and good. But at this late date, it turns out that these things didn't go anywhere, that they didn't really get beyond Marxism, actually. And so it's worth keeping in mind the original Marxism, because all the ways that people have tried to go beyond Marxism haven't paid off. So why not go back to the original and think about it, right? There's nothing to lose, really, right? And there might be a great deal to gain in doing so. But again, understanding that history is ancient now, it's old, and it doesn't have a direct application in the present. So it has a more of an abstract relationship to the present, which can be a liability, but can also be an asset. The asset is that it's sort of that indeterminate, more open-ended possibility is preserved. Meaning, yes, Marxism was bound to its historical moment, but if these ideas still resonate, still seem plausible, still seem to speak to the world that we live in, then maybe there is something more open to it, that's not just pegged to the past, that's not just bound to its moment originally in the past. So there's that aspect of it, which I think is very important. That Platypus tries to keep that tension, the tension between what made all these departures from Marxism plausible, how do they still remain plausible to people, but also how is Marxism still plausible in its original form? And how do we think about the tension between those things and think about that as a phenomenon of history? How to deal with the world that we live in as the product of the past, product of the failure of the struggle for socialism, raises all sorts of questions. So it seems like a kind of productive, fruitful terrain between these two poles of various post-Marxisms and the original Marxism historically. So that's Platypus. Platypus is a very intellectual, almost academic exercise. It's not really part of academia, official academia, but it does have this kind of, thinking, talking about things, hosting the conversation on the left, that aspect of it. Obviously, that's not sufficient to get anywhere politically that I might want to get to. Right. So I, of course, would like to, I'm not just a Marxist, I am a socialist, actually, politically.
And by that, what exactly do you mean?
I think that this society still stands under the task of realizing the potentiality of capitalism, right, and not succumbing to its pathologies. Right. So I still believe that this society is afflicted not by bad ideas or bad practices or bad attitudes and bad psychology, but by an actual contradiction.
Which is?
I think that we suffer from the contradictions of capitalism, the contradictions between a kind of bourgeois, enlightened, liberal, democratic, civil society spirit of cooperation and cosmopolitan, universal, humanistic brotherhood, solidarity. I do think that is an objective tendency of the society, that the society does generate that, while it also contradicts it and undermines it in a very harsh way.
And it does that by the vicissitudes of what the process of capital accumulation requires.
Yes. So in other words, I think that capitalism has a structural problem where to keep itself going, just as it is, requires massive destruction and crises. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that we don't have a kind of like the bourgeois spirit is inadequate to deal with the problems generated by capitalism. Right. So we're kind of helpless in the face of capitalism, meaning it's not that capitalism like must necessarily be destructive, because nobody wants it to be destructive, really.
Mhm.
It just is. And that we're not able to prevent its destructiveness with the means at our disposal. We really don't have the means at our disposal, practically, intellectually, theoretically, to prevent it from being destructive. Mhm.
Is that what you meant by the bourgeois spirit? Is that the
Yeah.
Mhm.
So it's this funny thing, it's like on the one hand, the bourgeois spirit is inadequate. On the other hand, it's the best we have.
And would it be fair to say that like all your critiques with the different kinds of the left and even your parents and your upbringing, it was all of that is imbued with this bourgeois spirit, right? In different
is.
inflections.
It
and-
is. I mean, there are obviously different levels, different, layers to this in social and political reality. But right. In other words, we live in a society where people who all want to do the right thing are going to inevitably clash over that. Right. And so the question is, where does that conflict lead? What is the result of it? And I understand the struggle for socialism as, at least potentially, a more productive way of pursuing the contradiction and the conflicts that result than what we've come to accept as ordinary politics in capitalism, which is, you mentioned the rackets. These things exist objectively, out of necessity, in the absence of something better. Better not in the sense of like ethically or morally better, but more productive, politically productive, kind of can move us forward historically.
in utilitarian terms.
Yeah, in utilitarian terms, absolutely. So, I think that there might be major conflicts, strife, even violence involved in the transition from capitalism to socialism, where the struggle will be among people who are fighting over socialism, like different tendencies, different, political disagreements, conflicts within, the struggle for socialism, where everybody's agreed we want this goal, but they disagree over how to get there. Now we have bizarre struggle over human rights, civil liberties. We have basically a struggle over bourgeois goals that then get very distorted or something. I mean, that's where I feel like, even the terms of things that are very self-consciously anti-bourgeois, anti-liberal democratic, like theocratic, like fundamentalist stuff, or like crazy racial, like fascistic type stuff, like, like Alexander Dugin kind of notion of like the inevitable struggle of like races and cultures and civilizations, that all of that is just a sort of a massive, diluted, distorted expression still of bourgeois right, of what, Hegel would call bourgeois right, or Marx would call bourgeois right. Meaning the actual presuppositions of it and the actual social reality that it articulates and expresses is still in bourgeois social terms, which is that what they want is a kind of adequate form of a relationship between the individual and the collective, in a society of cooperation.
Mhm. And you're
That's
saying
what
that
they
even in
want.
spite of, I don't know much about Dugan, but I think I know his type. So you're making the argument that Dugan, even if he has this kind of esoteric Oriental
Yeah,
mysticism,
like
uh,
Slavic, Russian, Christian Orthodox,
or
Eastern
like
Orthodox, and
landlocked
nonsense. Yeah,
people versus like ocean dwelling people,
yeah,
and we're in this like clash of civilizations, and our angels are above us fighting. You're saying even people that imagine that they're living in this kind of pre-modern or postmodern or whatever it isn't a modern secular.
atavistic, yeah, eternal, yeah.
You're
That the Russian people are the people of the steppe,
right,
and the Anglos are the people of the high seas or something. I mean, it's just, yeah.
but you're
Even then,
even that is in a mystified way modern and bourgeois.
absolutely, definitely. Yeah, I think it's just conditioned. The reality that they're trying to wrestle with is essentially, I mean, it is, I mean, you get the benign version of multiculturalism, of a kind of multicultural pluralism.
Mhm.
In other words, the kind of agony of, like, I don't know, Russian nationalism is, can they live in a world with other peoples without being stomped on, right?
Mhm.
And that's a legitimate thing. It is. I guess, like, in other words, like, what are the terms under which we're gonna reconcile to each other's existence, right? But I do feel like that's a modern concern. Like, I don't, I mean, I guess there are people who believe in some kind of ultimate racial suprematism where it is about wiping out the other peoples. But I'm not sure that that's even what they want. I think that what they want is just a situation where there isn't an international hierarchy,
Mhm.
to such a great disadvantage of peoples who have been the losers of history. The Russians, the Chinese. It's like the century of humiliation, right? The whole idea that the Chinese Revolution is not about getting beyond capitalism, but about China freeing itself from the century of humiliation, before the revolution.
Sure.
And and again, Russia was, it was invaded by Napoleon. It was invaded by the Germans in World War One and by the Nazis in World War Two. It was extremely traumatized, and it was devastated by neoliberal capitalism after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was. I mean, these are countries that experienced massive traumas. Are we surprised that they reach for crackpot ideologies that are about racial survival? And then the dominant capitalist world are just like, well, we got to contain these people until they can get with the program of, like, liberal pluralism and multicultural cosmopolitanism.
But also,
That's true.
we're going to need that gas.
Well, sure, and they want to sell it anyway. So but I feel like these are just about very marginal renegotiations of the political and social and economic status quo. There's, like, a lot of overwrought ideology, but in the end, I mean, does the Taliban want anything other than the Emirati, like the Gulf states? Don't they just want to be Muslim and just be in the world? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, where they, like, the caliphate or whatever,
Sure.
I kind of feel like this is just overwrought nonsense in
Sure.
the end.
Sure. And especially, I mean, you can point to, like, I'm imagining, I'm sure you can find individuals, especially at the top of hierarchies, like utter psychos, that, yeah, they do want to be the caliph on top of a world imperium. But is that, like, a serious risk to the world?
No,
And what you're saying is no.
no, it's not. And so I just feel like, again, I do think that in the end, we're not going to undo capitalism. We're not going to undo capitalism that way. We're not going to revert. That's not really going to happen. And so the only way out is through. And there has been a lot of thinking about this in the advanced capitalist countries. You know, there's been Marxism, obviously, but there's also been other kinds of thinking in the last 200 years. And, you know, again, what's interesting is the persistence of Marxism, the persistence of the original idea, like not some kind of tailoring of Marxism to some reactionary.
Or
Yeah, you
or
know,
worse.
yeah, exactly. Not adapting to some exigent circumstances, but you know, the original vision.
Mhm.
Like, and you know, isn't this relevant to everybody in the world? Pretty much. Doesn't this speak to the future of like Russia and China and India, and not just the United States and Europe? You know, I mean, I think that it does. I think that, you know, I think 50 years from now, people are going to be like, yeah, what was that Marxist thing again?
So the only thing that keeps coming up in my mind, because I generally, that argument attracts me, but then I think of the environment and the destruction that's been wrought by capitalism that looks like it's, I mean, we're at that, arguably, we're over the tipping point, and we're looking at some major environmental catastrophes down the road that may force a change in the way that we do things. How does moving forward into socialism, how can that square with the concern for the environment? You know what I'm saying? Because if it's going to take what's been built up by capitalism forward and use it totally in line with that, you know, for everybody, isn't that inevitably going to perpetuate the environmental problem?
Well, I mean, I think there's going to be green capitalism. That's what I think. In other words, I think the capitalists themselves are going to, you know, try to solve the problem. And that includes, you know, the politicians who are willing to just tinker with the basic social order that we have, you know. So I think that there will be green capitalism. And whether that will be sufficient, I mean, yeah, I think there are a couple of ways of thinking about it. One is that the massive environmental catastrophe is never going to happen. The other is that it's kind of already happened. You know, we're just going to be dealing with the effects, the ramifying effects moving forward. And that, as usual, those will impact poor people, vulnerable people the most. And it will indeed produce massive dislocations, migrations, wars, civil wars, international wars. It will involve a great deal of suffering. You know, millions will die as a result of climate changes. Okay, yes, that's probably just, that ship has sailed. That's going to happen. That's going to happen. Still, there's going to be, throughout that, society is going to reproduce itself through capitalism. The same basic problem over the control of human destiny by people will remain. There will be a dynamic of capitalism. There will be an unnecessary wastage and destruction that will impair our ability to deal with this or that issue, whether climate change or something else. You know, in other words, the question of socialism will still be posed. And one thing, you know, that I'll just say, even short of that, right, there are going to be revolutions, there are going to be civil wars, there are going to be, including in the United States. That's going to happen. Definitely going to happen. Inevitable, right? It's not like, oh, unless we turn to socialism, which just means some policies, then we're going to have. No, we're definitely going to have this. The question is, what's going to come of it? Right? So if there's a massive civil war in the United States, a political breakdown of the state, what's going to be the end result of it? Right? In other words, that crisis will be generated by capitalism, but will we undergo that trauma and sacrifice just to remain in capitalism? That's probably true too. Right. So it's not like we need socialism to prevent climate catastrophe. We need socialism to prevent social breakdown, political chaos. All these things are going to happen. Those ships have sailed. There's nothing we can do about that. That's coming. It will happen. But where will we be on the other side?
And
That's what I'm thinking about.
I think here's where maybe I differ from you, and I'm open to. Part of me would really like you to change my mind. I can imagine a world where like we would regress from an Enlightenment bourgeois spirit to a anarcho feudalistic. I don't know exactly how it would go down. It would be technologized, and why couldn't we disintegrate into little ethno-nationalist and religious enclaves?
We already have.
Yeah,
we already have.
And are you making the argument that basically, let's say we have, and it'll get worse, will our warlords and our chieftains just make our peace with capital, and it will still be mediated?
Yes. In other words, they already have done so. Right. In other words, we do live under the rackets. We do live under the rival warlords, and they will kill each other and kill us along the way if they can. They will also make deals out of their self-interest to avoid the worst conflicts, and we'll have to live with the terms of those deals.
Mm-hmm.
That's already the world.
And we'll be able to, or most of us will, presumably because the terms of that will be mystified.
Oh, that this will go on, yeah, because in other words, it will seem like that's the only choice, right? That's the way things have to be. And again, we've been doing that for a while. For a considerable amount of time, we've already adapted to that reality. And it will be, it won't have to be, we live in dystopia already. There's no dystopic future waiting for us. We're there. We're already there. I think that in the 60s, people saw that, by the way. They saw that they were already living in dystopia. Right. But they also thought we don't have to accept it. So that's the question. Like, can we recognize that we already live in dystopia, but we don't have to accept it? Right. Now, so I brought up the platypus stuff about the negative, right? There is like the positive. The positive is people still struggle under these conditions. They still do things. There is still a baseline level of social cooperation that takes place. And yes, it's harnessed to the dominant capitalist political interests. It is. But it also, is not entirely reducible to that. And so the question is whether socialists can get involved in that, or whether, I feel like my generation's experience is that to be on the left is just to go through a kind of youthful radical phase before you become a Democrat, before you join the Democratic Party. You are made into a useful tool of the rackets, or you're not. Right, and then you're depoliticized.
And that involves a certain amount of forgetting. The people in the 60s just literally forgot whatever it was that they'd realized.
And concrete circumstances seem to change to such an extent that, again, it seemed irrelevant suddenly. And again, I do feel like even in the millennial left experience of the students that I've tried to educate, I think that's happened in their own lifetimes, which is that they did have a sense of possibility, but within 10 years, it seemed like that sense of possibility was kind of derealized for them. And then they were just facing concrete circumstances, either of personal individual existence or of the social political landscape and ideological landscape, that they weren't prepared for. and that seemed to change the terms so fundamentally that whatever inkling they had of a better possibility just evaporated. In other words, what do you do when, it's the financial crisis, Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, it's like the sense, and then it turns to Black Lives Matter, right? And it just seems like it doesn't translate. It's like, oh, that's an entirely other problem, and so whatever sense of possibility I had is wholly irrelevant to this new social crisis that I'm expected to commit to in some fundamental way. And again, it's kind of like, and then after that it will be like, oh, I was so jacked up on anti-racism, but then suddenly I'm going to be dealing with something else that seems to have nothing to do with it.
Well, it seems to me they cobble it together by saying this is all against like patriarchal white supremacy.
Yeah, in very general terms, but concretely, again, like what are the issues and what are the political choices on offer? I think that there are fads in capitalist politics and on the left. There are passing fads. And capitalism does have a way of adjusting to these changes in fashion and, adopting the rhetoric and mouthing the pieties, all that stuff. So again, the question is whether people who want to be socialists long term, whether they can avoid the fate of either depoliticization or becoming Democrats. Right. And, and also, I guess, a third fate just being kind of fossilized sectarian cranks. Right. Which I always feel the danger for me personally is, it's like, okay, am I just going to become some artifact of my own time that outlives my moment? And again, that's where the hardcore Marxism seems to offer a way out, because it's like an abiding thing. It's an abiding theme.
Perennial.
That goes through these seemingly massive changes that turn out in retrospect to be rather superficial changes. That seemed extremely urgent and life-altering at the time, but turn out to not really be all that profound. And so, can we get people to commit? Because the other side of it, the practical side of it, the more like political as opposed to just intellectual side of it, would be can people do what liberal civil society organizations do at the level of mutual aid and solidarity and helping organize people? Can socialists do what otherwise like churches do or Democrat Party affiliated NGOs do? Not that they do all that much, but can that serve a long-term development of a socialist politics, as opposed to just a youthful kind of fever dream, like over-enthusiastic, jacked up on ideology, kind of like adolescent phase of pseudo-radicalism?
Right.
That's the challenge, and Platypus doesn't really do that. Doesn't get people involved at the level of like activism. That's like a whole other ball game, and it requires different skill sets and talents and experience.
So would it be fair to say, can I try and re-summarize your perspective on Marxism and modernity? And because I think it's hard for a lot of people to grasp. So are you saying that we had all of pre-modern history, and we have modernity, we have this bourgeois spirit where we believe people are individuals, they should be free to reason, they should be free to associate with each other, create society, transact with each other, make the world.
Live and let live attitude.
Right. Yeah.
A live and let live attitude. Yeah.
All of which, like in American politics, both like most conservatives and most liberals, in theory, they agree on this baseline of people should be free to be themselves.
Mhm.
And the disjunct comes in with capitalism. You have this need to always be accumulating more money at the expense of labor power. I'm not great at speaking Marxist jargon, but
Sure.
but there's this, on the one hand, you have this nice, let's all live together, hold hands, rainbows. But then you have
On
like,
the other hand, it's a struggle to survive.
yeah, on the other hand, I need you to come into work and I need to pay you only $80 and I need to make 120. And I need to do this not just because like the problem is I'm your boss and you're my employee, but like I have bosses and there's a chain of capital accumulation happening. And
Yeah, we have to do this to stay in business.
mhm. and,
Otherwise, you won't have a job.
and whole
We
sectors,
pay you too much, you won't even have a job.
yeah, and whole sectors of the economy and whole countries can just get jacked when, okay, it's time for
Yes.
America's industry to turn into the Rust Belt.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
and what you're laying out is, I think, for the bourgeois spirit to overcome the contradictions of capitalism, that's what socialism would be. It would be us working together to create a new politics and a new economy that would not be so brutal and against our professed values.
Right. In other words, build a political force internationally that could get a handle on these dynamics. Not expect to immediately put an end to them, but also not simply be subject to them in the way that we are now. And there's a kind of a vested interest in the way things are done now. There is an interest in basically keeping the population quiet, meaning you don't want mass mobilization because it's too dangerous, it's too risky, it's too uncontrollable. And so the last thing that you want to do is mobilize people. You want to mobilize people enough to win your local political battle, but you don't want to really mobilize them, and you certainly don't want them to be organized in any way that would be, yeah, it would make them independent. And so it's and there's even a wisdom to that on the part of the capitalists. There's a wisdom to that. There's a rationality to that. That's not just a vested interest. Mass politics is dangerous. Mass mobilization is dangerous, and it could lead to bad outcomes, not necessarily good outcomes. But it seems to me that the only possible good outcome has to come this way, despite the dangers, because there is a great deal of danger. It's very simple. I don't think the left is interested in the white working class being mobilized. They really are not, because they realize that they're never going to convince these people to their cultural sensibilities. And so they'd rather them be quiet, and so, they flinch from that. They also don't want the majority of people of color to be mobilized either. What they want is some kind of middle class parity, equity among, a small group of people who can kind of set the terms for acceptable capitalist management. That's all that they only want to mobilize to the extent that it can facilitate that.
Yeah, and where I think what you're arguing for, it's a whole different paradigm shift than what most people on the left see like the horizons to be, which is that there's just like fascists on the far right, and then centrists, and then the left, and then maybe there's communists or anarchists, depending how far to the left you want to go. Whereas you're saying there's like, I don't know if you'd use the word ontological, but there's like a different world. There's socialism and there is capitalism, and they're both nested within the bourgeois spirit. Is that?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say, the issue is long term, we're not going to get out of the problem of capitalism unless we try to create a mass social and political movement in the United States. and which I think will have an immediate effect outside the United States, immediate effect. And, I think that it doesn't guarantee that we can overcome the problem of capitalism, but I also don't think that we can ever possibly overcome it without it. And I think that people still nurture a kind of a hope that if we can get the rich and powerful people to do the right thing, then we don't have to take the risk of fascism, right? We don't have to take the risk of mass mobilization that might produce like bad outcomes. And it's like, no, the rich privileged people are not gonna, they're not gonna just do the wrong thing. They're gonna try to do the right thing within the parameters of capitalism, and that will never be good enough. And, I think that we have to risk the danger, of the struggle for socialism, which has been shown to be dangerous. It has shown to be dangerous. It produced fascism in Italy and Germany. It did. Those mass movements of the right came out of a prior mass movement of the left among the working class and the middle class. It did flow out of that. And then, of course, Stalinism, the totalitarian states as mass political phenomena in places like the former Russian Empire and China. That kind of authoritarianism, it's a risk. It is a risk. And it can produce really terrible outcomes. It can. But I think that we have to take that risk because we're gonna suffer major human costs anyway. So we have to take the risk of political responsibility as opposed to something that we can just say, oh, it just happened. No one in particular is to blame.
And isn't it?
We have. And by the way, that's how socialists, if a socialist movement ever got off the ground, that's how they're going to be seen by the Democrats and the Republicans. They're going to be seen as a fascist movement.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be seen as a fascist movement. Most of the left today would see a real socialist movement as a fascist movement. They would see it as a dangerous plebeian authoritarian movement.
Right, because it would come from people that are of a lower
groups,
class in their in their estimation.
They're going to come from the dangerous classes.
And they want to upset the current arrangements.
And they want to upset the current arrangements, and that's going to seem very dangerous. It's going to seem ill-motivated, not only ill-conceived, but ill-motivated. And, that's going to be like the black poor are going to be seen that way too, not just the white poor.
And so is this insight why you've always been able to be more charitable to Trump and his supporters? Like, clearly you're not a fan, and like, to some extent it feels like you're trolling the left, but it is that you see there is some like socialist potential there, even if it's not actually going to come to that.
I mean, I don't think there's a socialist potential there. I think that if you can't deal with Trump supporters, you're never going to be able to deal with the working class.
Mm-hmm.
It's as simple as that, including like the Black and Latino Trump supporters who just seem like, holy shit, what are we dealing with? Right. But like, the women who support Trump, the gays who support Trump, the white straight males who support Trump. If you can't deal with these people, you have no business in socialism. What you have business in is capitalist technocracy that keeps the working class quiet. That's what you have an interest in. If you can't deal with the Trump supporters, because Trump is nothing. Trump is milquetoast. Trump is not a fascist. His supporters are not fascist. The fact that people think that shows how little they're able to deal with people. Right? I mean, Trump is a centrist. He was rejected by the Republican Party, not for being too extreme, but for being too much a Democrat. Like, that's why the Republicans didn't like Trump. And the Democrats don't like Trump because they see him as a threat, a competition. Right? They see that he's the key to the Republicans getting a majority that otherwise the Republicans have a hard time getting. Right? That he's stealing support from the Democrats. That's why the Democrats hate him. And it's not because he's extreme right wing. He is not. He definitely is not. And yes, some extreme right-wing people have crawled out of the woodwork to support Trump, but not consistently. And, so I always thought we need to demystify Trump and sort of, like dehystericize the reaction. So no way, was Trump representative of fascism or kind of socialism. But then again, I don't think Bernie Sanders represented socialism either. Right. I think that what they represent is an attempt to change the neoliberal bipartisan consensus status quo. And any attempt to change that is dangerous. It is. It potentially upsets the electoral system, at least, and potentially creates social problems that they're unprepared to deal with. It does. And so, they just have this kind of demagogic, and by the way, capitalist politics is always engaged in that. I feel like maybe there was a time starting in the 50s, maybe up until relatively recently, where they tried to like not engage in hysterics. But prior to that, like if you look at the 1800s or you look at the early 20th century, like Truman called Thomas Dewey, a liberal Republican governor of New York who was running against him for president. Harry S. Truman called him a fascist in 1948. Right? So I think there was a time when they kind of cooled it on that, a little bit in mainstream politics. Now that kind of hysteria has come back into mainstream politics. The left has always been hysteric. The left has always used overblown rhetoric and stupid demagogic nonsense, mostly to appeal to adolescents and their mindset, but I would say the thing with Trump is that Trump is a symptom of the crisis of the old political consensus that isn't really working, right? And so does he represent something dangerous in terms of breaking the division of labor between the parties and the way they divide the electorate? Does he throw a wild card into the mix that they don't want to deal with? Yes, he does, but in the most limited and containable, controllable, mild way possible. I don't think there's really much of a danger of a mass right-wing movement right now. I don't. I think it's still pretty fringe. The extreme right is still pretty fringe. That doesn't mean like, capitalist politics can devolve into violence, into stuff. It can do that. Whether it intends to or not, it can do that. They can lose control, and they can play brinksmanship and take a wrong gamble. They can lose a gamble. They can make a risky bet and lose. They can open a can of worms. They can do that. I don't know. So yeah, so we should maybe wrap up, definitely. But I would just say that on that note, my argument against the left's histrionics around Trump is an argument against them using Trump as an excuse to fold back into the Democrats.
I get that. I have one last question if we have, or I don't know, Spencer, did you?
And I was just going to say, and riffing off that, would it be fair to say they're using him as another way to mystify this fundamental contradiction between our bourgeois liberal values and the discipline that capitalism demands?
Certainly, they certainly do. And they, I think that for them, talk about like, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, like that if you take that stuff too seriously, it's dangerous. Right. In other words, you're supposed to pay lip service to those things, but you're not supposed to take that too seriously, because we're not prepared to really take those things seriously. We have to accept a certain amount of abridgment of civil rights and a narrowing of, democracy. And so, you can't tell the people that they have rights, and you can't like point out the rottenness of the small d democratic electoral system, because it can't it can't end well, right? If you get people to start scrutinizing elections and how they happen, and you get people to believe in their rights, it just can't end well, can it?
And actually,
Right.
like,
So
real rights to material prosperity, not just the right to vote for a candidate.
right. Or even like civil liberties. It's like, oh, tell people that they have the right to bear arms. It's like, it just can't end well, if you get people too wedded to these ideas, you know, because then, how are you going to get them to accept the inevitable abridgment of those rights? It's like the NRA accepts a lot of abridgment of the right to bear arms. They do. And so you don't want to get people too attached to the idea that they have a right to self-defense, right? Because it's just going to create too many problems. In other words, you want the police to be pretty sure that if they find a gun on someone, that they're a criminal. Like, the police are going to have a much harder job.
And certainly if they're part of the underclass.
Yeah, the police are just going to have a really hard time dealing with an armed citizenry, because how are you going to divide the criminals from the non-criminals if everybody's got a gun? If the police can't say, yeah, in capitalism, if you can't say, well, if you have a gun, you must be up to no good. Like, if that can't be a safe assumption, it makes it much harder for the police to do what they do, which, just keep order, right? And arrest the right people, not do what they do in the sense of committing the crimes that they commit and abusing people, because they do that too. But even to do nominally what they're supposed to do, it would be much harder for them. So, we're not prepared. And that's where, the Democrats have a kernel of truth, where they're just like, we can't live according to these founding principles because we don't live in that society anymore, right? It's not 1776 anymore. Of course, they're right about that. Those principles don't apply in a modern capitalist society. They don't. Right. So, again, I just feel like, or even foreign policy, can we question a policy of containing Russia or not? Or if you mess with that consensus, won't that embolden Putin to invade the Ukraine? Maybe it did embolden Putin to invade the Ukraine. Trump's desire to soften the containment policy, maybe it did create a window of opportunity for something bad to happen. Maybe, right? So, but again, like, just think about it, how little we can question things, really, because they're struggling to keep a lid on all sorts of things,
So this is kind of moving in a different direction, but I did want to make sure I ask this before we go. So Spencer and I are interested both in serious Christianity and serious Marxism. And we have attempted to kind of put the two together. We're aware of the sort of left liberal tendencies of, for instance, Catholic worker and liberal theology, and the fact that that's not good enough. And we know we're in kind of rare territory trying to do this. And I guess it is like you said a while back, that Marxism, it provides this continuity. It's kind of like a classic that you can always move back to. There, the same thing could be said for Judeo-Christianity. And I just wonder if, obviously, a lot of people don't understand religion well enough either.
Right. Right.
What do you think of that project? I mean, is that, and I'm not asking you whether you agree with it or not, but is that a doable project in your view? And just what is your reaction to it?
It's tricky. So I know that you had, when you emailed me, you mentioned this as a potential topic. And I did feel like if we talked about that, I'd have to put on my Nietzsche hat or something, or my Nietzsche mustache or something. And, and say, beyond good and evil. In other words, you could see Nietzsche as a negation of Christianity. You could also see him as a kind of fulfillment of Christianity, as a kind of following a logical conclusion. And of course, it's not just Nietzsche, it's really modern society. And as the issues of which are articulated by Nietzsche in a useful way, I think. It's also the Hegelian point of bourgeois society being a kind of secular realization of Christianity that simultaneously negates Christianity. It kind of transcends it. So I do think that insofar as the society fails to realize its bourgeois ideals, then the question of Christianity does return. It does. But we have to understand that as like a symptom and as a paradox, right? And because we do live in a post-Christian world. And I think that we also have to be aware of the fact that billions of people in the world are living in a non-Christian world and yet still a capitalist world.
Mhm.
Asia, obviously. So like Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, and then of course there's Islam, my partner who's Muslim. There's the Islamic world, although the Islamic world, we could expand Judeo-Christian to be Abrahamic, right? We could say, well, maybe there's this Abrahamic tradition that does seem to have some longue durée historical legacy in the modern world. In other words, you can find plausible roots for modernity in Islam, in Judaism, and in Christianity. You can. You can also, though, in the Eastern religions, right? So, obviously Christianity is huge. Christianity is the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, it's Africa. Europe is a Christian, post-Christian, there are considerable numbers of Christians in East Asia too, but I think that what we'd have to recognize is how the capitalist world, which also means, at least in one side of it, a bourgeois world, has encompassed the human race in a very profound way. Things have been bourgeoisified and also rendered capitalistic despite the different religious traditions, right? And again, that's where I have in mind like Nietzsche saying, well, maybe Christianity is going to devolve into Buddhism, into a kind of worldly resignation, as opposed to a mission of redemption. And of course, what he had in mind was like a Protestant Christianity. That's his background. That's what he's reacting to. He is reacting to a kind of bourgeois Christianity, a kind of Protestant, and in that way, the Hegelian Christianity, as opposed to Catholicism. I always like to point out the Counter-Reformation also made Catholics Protestant. In other words, it was the Protestantization of Catholicism, the Counter-Reformation. In other words, it kind of rationalized Catholicism as Christianity in the bourgeois era. So I do think that we do need to be able to grasp history in a cross-cultural, multicultural sense. And, we have to recognize the difficulties in trying to recover a pre-bourgeois or even early bourgeois perspective. I do think that we leave off bourgeois society before capitalism in the secular age, in the Enlightenment, in a kind of a post-Christian moment. Kant and Hegel, are they anti-Christian? No. Are they Christian? No. And then in the capitalist era, I do think that we stand with Marx and Nietzsche in this kind of ironical relationship to Christianity, where capitalism is a kind of fulfillment, but it's also a negation of that Christianity. Now, that's one way that I have of thinking about like our kind of deep cultural values and their long historical background, and how one can find a long history to the values that animate the society today. The political realm, however, this is where I bring in Nietzsche. That's why want to say beyond good and evil, because I want to say we live in the era of Napoleon. We live in the era of politics. We live, in the aftermath of the American and French revolutions, which were not Christian, that were radically secular. And that is the political world that we live in, and also the social world that we live in. The United States Constitution, was it written by devout Christians? No, not really. Was it written by like Christians? Kind of. But generally they were like late 1700s kind of deistic kind of Christians, and that's really the baseline world, I think. Some kind of minimal deistic Christianity or something, where all religions recognize God, just the different faces of God, like that kind of language that you hear from official religion, from like Protestant ministers and Catholic clergy and Jewish rabbis and Islamic clergy, teachers, that we all, and Buddhists and Hindus, they will all say, we all worship the same God, even if we define it somewhat differently. Okay, but I do think that politics challenges the realm of morality. And that's where politics is beyond good and evil. And politics meaning the political necessities of capitalism that go beyond a moral compass. The struggle for socialism will also necessarily do that. It will have to defy a moral compass. And again, as dangerous as that sounds, that doesn't mean adopting nihilism as a attitude. So I don't think Nietzsche's a nihilist. I think he sees the danger in a kind of pseudo morality that masks a deeper nihilism. Right. So I do think that we're, the spiritual struggle of our age is essentially a political one, and is not reconcilable to a moral estimation. And again, capitalism already does that. I think the struggle for socialism will also continue that by necessity, not because it's good, not because this is desirable, but because it's inevitable.
Because it is.
Because it is. Yeah, I mean, we're gonna have to struggle politically in a way that will not always be. I mean, maybe Christianity has some resources for that. I feel like maybe all modern religions probably have resources for accepting human fallibility, exigent circumstances. I mean, it could be as simple as render unto Caesar what Caesar is due, and render unto God what God is due, that old Christian idea. In other words, that we have to fight for the temporal, and maybe that's a different thing from the eternal and celestial, right? So the alternative being that we would sort of try to instrumentalize religious values, and try to give a moral gloss to what are political exigencies, which I think we shouldn't want to do. I mean, I guess I'm committed. What I was saying earlier about justice, struggle for socialism is not going to be directly a struggle for social justice. People will be motivated by a sense of injustice and a desire for justice, but it's really going to be about freedom, not justice. And
or would it be fair to say, put another way, the answer isn't to just try and like negate what's already wrong with the world. It would be about positively creating another world that would,
and realizing the potential of this world, and realizing like the sacrifices, which are not just material sacrifices, but are also spiritual and moral sacrifices. that have been exacted upon us by capitalism. The question is, what is it all going to amount to? What's going to be the result of that sacrifice that we've made and will continue to make? What's going to be the end result of that? Right? And it can't be existential absurdism or kind of ironical, distance, or a kind of purely individual spiritual retreat. I mean, those are always available, those are always there, but politics demands something else, I think. And that's why I think, that's why I'm not very sanguine about the reconciliation of religion and politics. I think it's not necessary to reconcile them. They might be irreconcilable,
But
and that's
but it seems to me, and riffing off what you were saying at the very beginning, is it not necessary to reconcile if we're ever going to have a socialist revolution, dictatorship of the proletariat? Isn't that going to have to be reconciled with religious believers?
Yes, for sure, definitely. But again, I think that yes, right. And so, it's not about being anti-religion. It's not at all about that. It's about recognizing that, generally speaking, religion is going to cause people to resign themselves to their fate or turn away from politics with a healthy disgust. Right? If people remain in either of those places, we can't do what's politically necessary. So we need enough people to say, I need to struggle in the here and now, right? And I need to, not violate my moral principles, but also, maybe ask God's forgiveness for things that have to be done.
Yeah, well,
Which we're already doing.
People are already doing that, right? So I'm just saying, it's not like socialism has to handle this in a very profoundly different way. It doesn't. But maybe we can be more truthful to ourselves about that compromise.
Oh yeah, that would be good. Yeah, honesty.
Yeah, just honesty about it. Which again, I think seriously minded religious people are actually capable of that honesty. So I'm just against the demagogic abuse of religion.
Yeah, well, I think we agree with that. There's so much resources there, so many resources, I should say, for organization that have been sort of blown apart, especially in American Christianity, but they're still there that, I would love for them to be used to move society forward rather than, I don't know, in the other direction.
No, but they're wise. I always like to point out, like around immigrant rights, whether it's evangelical Christians or the Catholic Church, like they help immigrants, they help illegal immigrants. And they break the law to do it. And they operate on both sides of the border. And they're just driven by a desire to help people. And, but yet they also know how to navigate things so that they're not just breaking the law, so it's not like some kind of spectacular civil disobedience. They just do it quietly. They just do what has to be done to help people. And socialists have to be able to operate that way. Right?
Right.
They need to be able to operate just exactly that way and be as sure about what they're doing as the Christians are in what they're doing. Right? But we need like a historical sense of mission that gives us a stable sense of purpose in the way that religion does for other people.
Mhm. And it would be nice if down the road, there could be genuine cooperation, even if there isn't
Right.
complete.
Exactly.
There's no reason why there shouldn't be, you
There's
know?
no reason why there shouldn't be cooperation. Absolutely. In other words, like just at that level, if one were to engage in like immigrant rights type of activity by socialists, you would have to work with these religious activists and organizations as well. You'd
Mhm.
have to have a modus vivendi. And I think that it would be completely possible. I mean, would you be in some ideological competition? Maybe, maybe not. In other words, maybe, socialists can reach people in terms of keeping them active in a way that the religious people can't, and vice versa. The religious
Mhm.
people can keep people active in a way that the socialists can't, at least at first. So, I think again, it's like, and we have to understand that that's just very different from the way religion is mobilized by the capitalist politicians.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And
So we can't
I'm
like
sure
turn it off.
like the cause of sort of writing the Christian ship is about as bleak as writing the Marxist ship at the moment. So
Yeah,
it will totally